I think we're ready to get started on our next presentation, and that's going to be by Angela Jaillet-Wentling, and the title is Telling Untold Stories of Underrepresented Populations. Angie attended Penn State University for her bachelor's degree and Indiana University of Pennsylvania for a master's degree, and has worked in cultural resource management for various firms and agencies since 2008. Her most recent role is as Cultural Resource Program Coordinator for Pennsylvania's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources.
Thanks, Dr. Carr. As mentioned, I've been working in cultural resources management sector for over a decade now, but my focus on the historical archaeology of underrepresented communities has really evolved since my graduate school years, culminating in my thesis work at the settlement of Indian Run or Pandanarium, which you just heard from Sammy about. Most recently, since taking on my role at DCNR, I've been really blessed with this opportunity to expand on work like this in a capacity that I really hadn't previously hoped for. So our newly formed Cultural Resources Program, like dating to April of 2021, functions as do many other agencies with basic project review, but also it's as a resource to help manage and interpret the cultural and historic properties that reside on our 121 state parks and over 2 million acres of state forest land. On Monday, actually, our first cultural resources field crew hit the ground running, and as they work through projects on DCNR lands, part of their focus will be also to undertake research and archaeological investigation into the many underrepresented peoples of our Commonwealth. So with that, I don't know. Oh, it's not. Sorry. Figure out these tools we have here. Oops. I hope you all don't mind, but I always feel like my thank yous kind of get lost in the sauce at the end of presentations. So with that in mind, I really do want to acknowledge all of the people that make these types of projects possible. It's all collaboration, and most of that hinges on building and maintaining relationships with the peoples we seek to serve, not least of which are the descendant communities, local historians and advocates, landowners, Native and Indigenous groups to and within Pennsylvania, our vast network of volunteers, partners with academia and nonprofits, mentors, and just the general goodwill and intentions of our staff at DCNR. And just to give everybody an overview as to where I'm headed in this presentation, I'll start with an introduction of sorts, not necessarily on Indian Run or Pandanarium, so much as the lessons myself and collaborators have learned as we sought to expand the narrative there. It's these lessons that I've relied on in developing our research agenda in regards to many of the African American resources in our parks and forests. I'll go on to highlight some of the efforts that are currently underway in regards to specific sites and our objectives at each. Following that conclusion, I'd be happy to take questions and or input on our plans for future investigations and interpretations. I hope everyone had a chance to take in Sammy's presentation about the Freed African American community at Indian Run or Pandanarium. You'll notice that throughout, I'm going to be using both names interchangeably. In recent communications with the descendant community, they indicated that part of the issue in linking the past community to its present was in fact the name we were using. In doing the archaeology and public outreach, we used the term most frequently coined in the 20th century texts, knowing that it was a 20th century term and hoping that it was the same one that would resonate with the descendants that had possibly grown up there. Wrong. In talking with the Allen family descendants, the Rankings, the Crawls, and the Warden families, they indicated that they'd grown up hearing about Indian Run, not Pandanarium. The Lewis family descendants, Bill and Amanda Mary Davison, had learned of their family history through genealogy and the grapevine, so they hadn't experienced the same disconnect. But my favorite quote to go by, especially with this type of research, is Dr. Maya Angelou's, "I did then what I know to do, or what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." This was one of many lessons that we learned working at Indian Run that we can take with us moving forward with community-oriented archaeological investigations. In many ways, we retooled historic documentation for our own purposes. In my own studies that began in 2010, the questions regarding how the community developed and why were at the forefront of our investigations. So I undertook a qualitative comparison of the selected attributes of location, site size, topography of site, layout, basis for establishment, and central focus. In a nutshell, the African American community at Indian Run or Planetarium most closely resembled the rural village of Hadley in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, a local example, and Mulberry Row at Monticello in Albemarle County, Virginia, a regional example of where the descendants had come from. The settlement's similarity to Hadley was, or I'm sorry, not the descendants, the actual inhabitants of Planetarium. The settlement's similarity to Hadley was primarily in its location, site size, topography, layout, and its basis for establishment. It most closely resembled Mulberry Row at Monticello in its topographical location, spatial layout, basis for establishment, and its structural orientation along the southern side of the road. The slaveholding Everetts, who manumitted the enslaved in 1848, provided motivation for the establishment of the community as an initial ideological impetus and financial backing for the endeavor. But it was a handful of Northern abolitionists acting with the mental template of a Northern town, what a Northern town looked like in their mind, that built the original layout. So led by local abolitionists and landowner John Young, the abolitionists were tasked with the construction of the settlement. Historic documentation and landscape analysis indicated that upon their arrival, the 63 freed African Americans and their families immediately began renegotiating the landscape of the structured settlement, where the ideas of the Southern planters and the realities of the Northern abolitionists left space, the incoming African Americans made place. They went to the additional effort of building homes along Indian Run, despite the purported 24 houses along the road uphill. The question became why. With the original structures placed along their historic road, the inhabitants were essentially contained within the settlement, similar to the setup of many slave roads. The primary route out of and into the site structures would have been along this one historic road. One possible motivation for the building of structures along the stream was its proximity to the external roads that connected the site with the community outside Indian Run, as well as the water. Rather than live in structured isolation or segregation, the African Americans inhabitants chose integration. The floods following their arrival likely put a temporary generational halt to additional attempts to live along the seasonally inundated stream banks at Indian Run. Another tack I chose was to look at historic era aerial photography and historic mapping while applying more recent methods like analysis of light detection and ranging data, collection of ground penetrating radar data. I expanded on the background research with basic archaeological survey methods like shovel test pit and test unit excavations. The landscape analysis focused on the original and subsequent layouts, showing that the community's structure developed from the builder's template to the inhabitants' multi-generational restructuring of the site. Shown here from top to bottom, on the left is the 1873, or on the top left is the 1873 Hopkins County Atlas. Below that is the 1905 USGS topographic map and a circa 1900 depiction of the settlement's remaining inhabitants. To the right is the geo-rectified 1939 aerial photograph showing remnant field lines and roads, features like orchards, farms, and residences, as well as potential occupations. This photo would have been taken near the end of what we think the settlement lasted. The last families were leaving in the 1930s. The majority of archaeological investigations conducted have really focused on the Allen family, as Sammy had mentioned. Two of the original settlers, John and Rosie Allen, built a life, raising a number of their children and grandchildren and watching their families grow to incorporate multi-generations living in this community. The John and Rosie Allen residence is situated at the center of the site, and its continued occupation from 1854 until circa 1900 speaks volumes to its persistence as a created space or home place, after bell hooks' use of the term, while also placing it at the heart of the later settlement, as opposed to being one among many houses along the interior roadway. Robert Allen, John and Rosie's son, was born at the settlement and would later build a home for his multiracial family on the northeastern corner of the settlement. His wife, Lizzie, is listed as white in the 1880 U.S. Census, and their children, Joseph, Samuel, Willard, and Reddy, were all described in the census as mulatto. By taking a look at how the family grew and persisted on the landscape, it became evident that 20th century retellings left out the longevity of the settlement and the stories of its multiple generations. While public outreach has continued, so too has research into the historical documentation of the community. In one of the earlier slides, you can see how the historic maps of this period indicate an enduring, if faint, presence of the settlement at the beginning of the 20th century. Census records from East Lackawanna Township for the years 1860, 1870, 1880, 1900, 1910, and 1920, and 1930 also confirm the persistence of the community, despite local historical accounts appearing in the newspapers and county histories that had already written them out of history. By bringing in additional historical documentation as well as archaeological insight to consider the community in a more complex context, a different picture emerges from the one that you'd have been led to believe. Much of this emergent picture aligns with what Reverend Roland Barksdale Hall, a local historian, has shared of the written history of George and Carolyn Lewis's family. I think one of the more notable things about Pandonarium is that it confronts misconceptions or overgeneralizations about the enslaved, the slaveholding classes, abolitionists, colonizationists, and free African Americans in the antebellum period, as well as in our own times. The larger narrative of America at this time and at that time is too often one presented as dichotomies. Stories are simply told as in North versus Black, or North versus South, Black or white, right and wrong. None of these concepts, of course, were or are mutually exclusive of each other. The potential for sites like Indian Run or Pandonarium is to help highlight people that lived in the intersections, the crossroads between, within, and outside the dichotomies and the margins. It's by better understanding the past and its nuances and how we record it and how we preserve it that we can build a better path forward in our own times. Building that path means recognizing potential for harmful bias in the historical record and ensuring we're not part of its continuation. With limited firsthand accounts, Indian Run's African Americans fell prey to what can be considered a revisionist local history rife with latent racism, as illustrated by one of the newspaper articles here. Many of the newspaper accounts and histories talk in weighty words, judgmental phrases, and overtly racist terms. As recently as 2000, a story in the local newspaper, the Sharon Herald, shown here, included unsubstantiated claims laden with racist phrases. Also, phrases like Dr. Everett's dream would turn into a nightmare. Southerners weren't prepared to face harsh northern winters. Settlers blamed one another for stealing, even going so far as to claim that some surrendered themselves back into a life of slavery. Many of the secondhand accounts end on early and rapid failure of the settlement, frequently citing things like flooding, sickness, even ineptitude, and dispersal of the population. But archaeology and historical documentation directly dispute that telling. When we preference one singular narrative and use their words or blindly buy into their biases, we lose the whole of a shared experience. So if we're going to expand the narrative, one of the most important outcomes of that effort is going to have to be making space for the descendant community to take part in the discussion and preservation of their past. Developing and maintaining relationships with the local and descendant communities is just the beginning. We need to focus and incentivize our preservation efforts on underrepresented groups, while also allowing for alternative forms of history, not traditionally preferred, like oral histories. If there isn't a space for others to tell their stories, we need to make that place. Much like the three disparate groups did at Pandemonium and Indian Run 166 years ago. Moving forward with our work at Indian Run, it is our hope that the community, specifically the descendant communities, can play a more central role in determining our directions there. So kind of moving on to the second half of the presentation is really something that I wanted to talk about, was pulling from our experiences with the community and at Indian Run or Pandemonium, or Site 36 METs and historical documentation helped reevaluate 20th century interpretations of the site. A big focus really becomes dispelling the harmful and racist readings of the community, as Sammy presented on earlier. Many of the lessons learned at Pandemonium could be applied to DCNR's evolving approach to publicly owned and interpreted cultural resources to the benefit of present and future populations. We manage the Commonwealth's 121 state parks and 2+ million acre forest system with countless archaeological and historical sites to manage and interpret. Its recent initiatives, like a new strategic plan, Penns Parks for All, and establishing a cultural resources program with a field crew, are some of our more significant steps towards enabling us to tell untold stories from the varying perspectives of a diverse population. In remembrance of Juneteenth this year, DCNR hosted a brown bag lunch session for employees featuring the tremendous efforts of the Mount Tabor Preservation Project in Mount Holly Springs, as presented by Ms. Carmen James. DCNR's Secretary Cindy Adams-Dunn introduced the session and focused on what she called a more clear-eyed understanding of what can so often be hard history. What exactly makes it hard history varies, right? It can be hard to document using the same types of documents, so often biased towards a dominant culture. It can be hard for the public to believe that when we've been taught otherwise. It can be hard for the public to believe it can be hard to come to grips with the actions of our forebears. It can be hard to recognize our own biases and privileges. But for all the same reasons telling the history of underrepresented peoples is hard, these stories are worth telling. If we have a hope of navigating the nuances of social and political issues of our own times, we need to understand how we got here. In July 2021, DCNR also rolled out our Penns Parks for All, a plan for Pennsylvania's state parks of tomorrow, a set of strategies to take us into the next 25 years. The plan was put together with extensive public input, and one of the three main focuses is on ensuring that they are accessible and welcoming to all. By identifying gaps in our telling, researching the untold stories of our peoples, we hope to show the many histories that reside on our public lands and provide the space and place for people to expand on their own stories. Another central focus of our field crew's research is actually to provide what our educational specialists and interpreters have asked for, and that's content to aid in developing more informed interpretation and inclusive educational outreach. It is with these objectives in mind that I've taken with me as I visit our parks and forests, looking for areas that we can best serve a diverse public. Our new field crew's focus is really a three-part structure. We'll focus on DCNR projects requiring compliance type or Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, cultural resources, identification and evaluation level surveys, but we'll also focus on inventorying the historic structures and sites on DCNR lands. And most relevant to this presentation, we'll be focusing on research to support agency initiatives and interpretation like the objectives here. There are lots of sites that just about slap you in the face with potential when you walk onto them. The segregated civilian conservation corps camps are some of these. Hard history in northern contexts like Pennsylvania can be dealing with the presence of segregation well into the 20th century on public lands and as part of federal programs. For those of you not familiar with the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC for short, it was one of a handful of New Deal programs rolled out under the FDR administration. Within months of inauguration in 1933, existing federal agencies like the USDA and the Department of the Army pooled their resources and expertise to mobilize a citizen workforce to provide a working way out of the Great Depression. The CCC operated from 1933 to 1942, and while it is often touted as one of the most successful New Deal programs, most historians agree that its greatest flaw was its policy of segregation. This policy was under scrutiny, even in its own time, and eventually gave way to limited integration based on necessity. It also helped pave the way for integration of the military, as many of the CCC corpsmen went on to fight in World War II, effectively ending their program and policy of segregation. DCNR's education specialist and historian Paul Fagley has documented 30 African American camps with 20 different companies, of a total of 158 companies operating throughout Pennsylvania. Of these camps, at least 2 of the African American camps are identifiable in our parks today. Penn Roosevelt State Park, the one showed here, was largely created through the efforts of the CCC. Many of those men were the Black corpsmen of Company 361-C, shown here in their company photograph. The company operated at Penn Roosevelt from 1933 to 1935 and restructured the landscape still evident in the park today with some of its most prominent features, like its heavily forested hillsides, its pathways, a fish pond, actually shown here in the lower left-hand corner, as well as buildings like the mess hall at the top right that are now gone, and roadway winding through and around the forest. Paul Fagley's in-depth historical research focusing on the camp has laid a tremendous foundation upon which for archaeology to build. Where the documents grow silent, archaeology holds the greatest potential to unearth the stories of the men that served here. Our original intent was to begin the field work this fall, but due to a delay in hiring, as with all government agencies, right, we've pushed the start of field work to next spring and summer, which gives us more time to focus on the consultation and identifying our various communities, as well as supplemental background research to shore up the foundations Paul has so carefully laid for us. In the spring and summer, once the snows have melted and Penn Roosevelt is again accessible, we'll head out there for a pedestrian reconnaissance and metal detector surveys. If we can talk an academic partner into helping with the ground penetrating radar, we would like to include this in the first stage of non-intrusive work. The intent would be to hone in on where subsurface excavation in the former shovel test pit or test units could be most useful. Our 2023 work would largely focus on evaluation efforts, possible excavation, and assessment of themes for interpretation or memorialization. Moving west and slightly forward in time, we're also looking at a really wonderful comparison site at Pymatuning State Park. At Pymatuning, we're coming in at more of the ground level in terms of background research. In the next year, our intent is to undertake the heavy lift of background research, pedestrian reconnaissance, and mapping at Pymatuning CCC camp, where companies 2112-C and 2312-C were stationed from 1935 to 1938 to support outreach as well as to support outreach to identify communities. Our hope is to be able to compare this site's assemblage with the one at Penn Roosevelt, and in the future, other camps to answer questions about daily life during segregation, differences in accessibility and interactions with the surrounding communities, and more. One project that I'm really excited about is a community I recently field viewed with the staff at Laurel Ridge State Park. The Laurel Hill community included multiple generations of African American families, including the Smiths, Hirschbergers, Browns, Dormans, Haws, Wallaces, and Crawleys, that lived at the settlement from circa 1825 to 1969. The remote mountaintop location outside of Johnstown, surrounding iron industry towns like Cambria City and Morelville along the Conemaugh River, provides a really wonderful juxtaposition to what we think was happening at Indian Run or Panamerican. From what we know of in the background research, these families structured their community atop a mountain and used its inaccessibility to their advantage, ensuring their safety and continued freedom during the first half of the 19th century. Edinburgh Smith, one of the founders and a veteran, was actually murdered, and when the local law investigated, they surmised that due to how hard it was to find Mr. Smith's house, the murderer must have been someone familiar to him and his land. No arrests were ever made, and when the neighboring George Gates later confessed to the murder years later, no one believed him, as he was drunk at the time of his confession. He wasn't arrested or prosecuted, but he was hit by a train shortly thereafter. Today, the remains of the settlement include a partially fenced cemetery with 2 legible markers for the U.S. Colored Troops Civil War veterans and dozens of fieldstone markers and depressions. Nearby stand the remnants of the orchards, spring houses, an ice pond, and foundations. The park is working with the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown to undertake more extensive background research. And our field crew is set to survey and map the above ground features in the summer or fall of 2022. Our hope is that these efforts will provide the foundation for future investigations of the site. One of the other projects we're hoping to develop more fully is to identify sites within DCNR lands that may qualify for inclusion in the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Of the sites included to date, only one, Thaddeus Stevens's Caledonia Iron Furnace Monument at Caledonia State Park, is administered by DCNR. We know we have other associated properties, and we are hoping that by collaborating with local partners like the South Mountain Partnership and others, that we can begin identifying and nominating sites for this network. Again, if you haven't noticed, there's an overlying theme of collaboration that permeates all of our works within public lands. And interestingly enough to note is that the Caledonia Furnace Memorial, which it is not the actual iron furnace, was a reconstruction of a version of the iron furnace by the CCC. One of archaeology's greatest strengths is that it goes beyond what was written or said to what people did and how they really lived. By digging into the history of our parks and forests and taking a hard look, it is our hope that we can provide a nuanced and open-eyed view of our past for the future. With better tools available to broaden our perspectives, our hope is to better represent the present diversity of our Commonwealth and how we tell our stories and how we talk about the past. On that, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for sticking with me. And I know you've all seen this next slide again, but I really do want to make sure that I thank all the folks that are involved in these efforts. This is how efforts like these stay afloat. And then if you're looking for additional resources, this is my short list of great resources for research and ways to think about African American diasporic archaeology in Pennsylvania. So with that, I think we might have time for questions. I'm not sure.
Yes, I do think we have time for a few questions, just a few, but Janet, do you have any?
I have one specific to DCNR. DCNR has provided grants for parks, trails, and open green space for many years, especially if proposals help with source water into the Chesapeake Bay. Is it possible that proposals would be considered from cemeteries? Significant erosion is taking place at our site in York County after the farm land surrounding the cemetery was sold and a large housing area was built. The cemetery gets all the water runoff. It is the largest African American cemetery in our county. Should we invite DCNR to tour the site?
Okay. I'm not as familiar with all of our grant programs. As I mentioned earlier, the start of our cultural resources program was with me in April. So I'm still very much in the familiarization stage of kind of getting a handle on what all we have and what all we support. But I would say to definitely if this is something that you're looking at, producing a grant for, invite us out to the site. We can provide guidance. I would say specifically our Bureau of Recreation and Conservation is our wing that does most of the grant work. And we've been working, not only the different types of funding that we do, but also the Section 106 component to what we do, like in advance of that type of work. So I would like to think that we would be able to support efforts like those. So yeah, reach out to us, and hopefully I can put you in contact with the right people and myself, and we can move forward from there.